Alright, welcome back. So we were previously discussing the importance of the invention of alphabetic writing in ancient Greece and how that influenced unknowingly Socrates and his kind of foundational way of thinking about philosophy. So we're going to pick back up with Socrates' story now. We had previously said that he decided he was the wisest person because he was the only person who knew that he knew nothing. And so he had that going for him. I mentioned that as he was going around talking to various people in town, they found this frustrating. Eventually, someone decided, Miletus, to bring charges against him. And he brought basically two charges. One, that he was corrupting the youth, and two, that he was teaching against the gods. Both of these were somewhat serious charges. The Greeks, in part because of the founding of philosophy, were moving away from their Greek religion and believing in the Greek gods. But nonetheless, there were still laws on the books about kind of preaching or teaching against them. At the same time, corrupting the youth was a serious charge, and so both of these got brought against Socrates. Now, his trial, there's an entire dialogue Plato wrote about it, and it's interesting in itself, and I think reveals a lot of the way Socrates dealt with the world and himself. Now, as we've seen, a lot of democratic principles in the US are derived from this early form of democracy in ancient Greece. There's also a lot of parallels in the trial system. I want to play through kind of the historic version of it a little more closely. So the way trials worked in ancient Greece is that one citizen could bring charges against another, and there was a trial by a jury of peers. And this was usually a large number of peers, in the hundreds. And so each member would have a chance to question each other. For this reason, rhetoric was really important in ancient Greece. So I'm going to flip back over to the chart we have about the sophists. The most important thing about the sophists is that they taught rhetoric. So they taught rhetoric. Now, rhetoric could help you defend yourself in the court system, or it could help you propose laws that got pitched when you were meeting at the agora for kind of democratic sessions. So those skills were very important. Now, in the questioning, I'm going to focus more on the corrupting the youth, because that's kind of the discussion we've been having of Socrates. That's the most important. So, defending himself, Socrates comes out and says, okay, Miletus, you've brought these charges against me, but let's talk about this. Let's think about, how do you train a horse? Now, I don't know if you've ever trained a horse, but one person is how many people are supposed to train a horse. If a horse has multiple trainers, typically the training will not go very well. And so he asked Miletus, how many people ought to train a horse? And Miletus says, Socrates, of course, everybody knows a horse should only have one trainer. And Socrates says, yes, exactly. And that's how it should be with the youth of our city as well. And so I am actually the one who is training the youth of our city, and it's everyone else who is corrupting them. I'm actually the one true person to train them. And so this is kind of his defense against corrupting the youth. Now, they have a lot more debate, and I'm not going to go into all the details of that, but the next phase is the jury votes on whether or not the person's guilty. And so the jury votes in this case, and they do find Socrates guilty. They didn't find his arguments very persuasive. So at that point, in the Greek system, the person who has been convicted has to suggest their own punishment. The quirk here is that if the jury accepts that punishment, that is their punishment. If the jury rejects that punishment, that person is sentenced to death. So think about the psychology of that for a moment. If you've been convicted and you have to decide on a punishment for yourself, and you know that if your jury does not accept that, you'll be put to death, how are you likely to think about your punishment? Psychologically, most people are probably likely to pick something a little bit harsher than they would otherwise, because most punishments are probably going to be better than death. So you're going to go a little harder on yourself than maybe you would otherwise. The system was kind of psychologically manipulative in that sense. So what does Socrates do? He comes out and he says, well, as I've just told you, I am the one person who is actually truly benefiting our city. And so my punishment should be that you give me free housing for life and pay me a subsidy to continue doing my teaching. Hear that as a juror who just said he was guilty. I think as he's saying it, Socrates hears these and he kind of backs off. He says, oh, no, I'm just kidding. I'm not going to ask you to do that. I'll tell you what, my punishment should be a fine of 20 mina, which is basically, for us, the equivalent of $5. So he says, sure, I'll pay $5 as a fine for corrupting the youth. Again, this is such a tiny punishment that he has suggested. Most of the people who were in the jury were annoyed by Socrates, but likely did not want to see him put to death. You can be annoyed by someone, you can want them to be punished, but not want to see them put to death. There's a wide gap between those two things. Yet the way Socrates came out and kind of brazenly said, oh, you should actually reward me. Never mind, I'll give you $5. Put them in a tough spot. And so they voted and they rejected his punishment of a $5 fine. And so he was sentenced to death. As I've told you, most people really didn't want him to be sentenced to death. And so his friends, including his student Plato, kind of got together and did some wheeling and some dealing and decided they were going to pay off a couple people. And everybody agreed, okay, look, we really didn't want to see Socrates put to death. We'll let him escape, and he just has to leave Athens. And if he leaves and never comes back, we won't pursue these charges anymore. We're just going to look the other way. And so Socrates' friends come in and say, Socrates, wonderful news, right? We've arranged things. You just have to leave with us. You don't have to be put to death. And Socrates rejects that. He says, I am a child of Athens. I am who I am because I was raised here. And if Athens says that I've committed crimes that should sentence me to death, then who am I to disagree with that? No, I refuse to escape. And so he drank hemlock and died from it. So you can interpret these actions in a lot of ways. And a lot of philosophers and people have debated exactly how we should interpret his actions, right? Some people see him as just a jerk, an arrogant jerk who can't read the situation and botches his whole trial. Other people see him as almost a martyr for his cause, this new cause of philosophy. No, I'm interested in the truth and in what's right. And I'm going to stick by that. And if everyone else doesn't like it, I'm willing to die for it. Which is he? I mean, in some ways, that's for you to kind of decide yourself. And the truth is probably somewhere in the middle of those things. But this painting is from the death of Socrates. Now, the only reason we likely know all of this about Socrates is because his student Plato wrote it down. This is another great irony in light of Socrates' critiques of the form of writing. Now, Plato's early works, scholars think, mostly represent Socrates' idea, but they shift, and his later bodies of work, although still using Socrates as the main character, probably represent more Plato's own thoughts. And in Plato's work is where we see him develop this ideal form of everything that exists. So in some ways, the ideal form is an extension of an essential definition, an ideal form. So Plato says that everything that exists has an ideal form. So the chair that we talked about in an earlier video, right? There's an ideal form of a chair. Every chair that exists on our plane of reality is a poor copy of that. There's an ideal form of piety that exists, and every act of piety that exists on our plane of existence is a poor copy of that. Where do these ideal forms exist? Well, a lot of Christian philosophy drew on Plato after Plato's death. So Plato was incorporated into Christianity. So we're doing this a little anachronistically. But if we think about Christianity, where does heaven exist? We might say up, But that's not the literal answer, right? We can't get in a rocket ship and go far enough and get to heaven from a Christian perspective. It exists somewhere else. I mean, the closest we might be able to explain it is on another plane of existence. And it's something like that for Plato as well, right? We can never hike far enough, fly far enough, dive deep enough into the ocean that we can go to this place where the ideal forms exist. They are on another plane of existence. Why does this matter? Well, this matters for another important critique that Plato made that hangs heavily over the field of communication to this day. Plato critiqued art and theater, kind of the communication of his time, because each of these were only poor copies of the ideal forms. So if I have a chair, that's a poor copy of the ideal form of a chair. If I paint a painting of that chair, that painting is a poor copy of the chair, which is itself a poor copy of the ideal form of a chair. So all of art for Plato moves us further away from the truth. So art moves us further from truth. Okay, now we can start thinking about how this is going to come to a head with rhetoric. Rhetoric pre-existed philosophy, and this is where we're really going to connect with questions of democracy in ancient Greece and also plague. So we're going to look at how those three things come together: rhetoric, democracy, and the plague, and how those butt up against philosophy in our next video.